If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. In the years I've been hanging out with homebrewers, I've noticed a few patterns. For example, most people start with meager gear, then end up building a miniature version of a professional system before realizing their beer was just as good when made with less work, and then end up reverting back to a simpler setup. That's certainly been my experience. Now, another pattern I've noticed is that a lot of folks get into homebrewing to try their hand at crafting their favorite beer styles, usually some type of hoppy IPA, but then they eventually move on to other styles, perhaps to stave off boredom or, like me, to finally have the opportunity to try these beers that they may not, have readily available to them. And in doing this, new obsessions are often developed. You are listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to not only talk about his experience foraying into the world of farmhouse ales, but we're also going to be going over our perspectives of a handful of farmhouse beers he brewed and recently shared with me. I'm definitely looking forward to this one. Jordan, how about you?
Yeah, I'm super stoked to talk about some of these beers. I think some really fun ones have popped up over the last couple years, and that's kind of the beauty of farmhouse brewing is you can just bottle condition them and throw them in your closet or your basement and really enjoy them for years to come.
Yeah, it's awesome. Now, I've dabbled in farmhouse brewing, whether that be funky, wild, sour beers, however we want to define that, but I've never really gone down the path the way several of my friends have, and I'm not entirely sure why, because I think these types of beers are some of the most exciting to drink. Now, luckily, I have friends like you, Jordan, who have gone down that rabbit hole and have been more than willing to let me drink the fruits of their labor. This is going to be a fun one. Alrighty, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you're going to receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. The guest for this month, August of 2024, is the co-founder and head brewer of what I believe to be one of the best breweries in America, Ashley Carter from Bierstadt Lager House in Denver, Colorado. I'm fortunate enough to not only have had friends send me Bierstadt beer, but a few years ago, my family went on kind of a spur of the moment weekend trip to Denver, during which we spent many hours hanging out at Bierstadt. The beer Ashley and her crew are making is seriously some of the best I've ever had, up there with Freem, Chuckanut, and Wayfinder. It is so, so good. If you happen to love making lager styles as much as we do, or you just want to ask questions of one of the greats, this is the session for you. To be part of it, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, August 23rd, 2024, as Ashley's going to be hanging out with us that Saturday the 24th. All past sessions with folks like John Palmer and Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, you can learn more about becoming a patron and have a look at all of the cool rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit. They're efficient, easy to use, and they have a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a really great YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Tim Quinney wrote in all the way from Australia with some feedback regarding the current state of homebrewing. Tim said, with all the doom and gloom regarding the fall of homebrewing and how we can attract new blood, I got to thinking. I recently got my father and brother-in-law into brewing, or at least letting me brew extract kits for them. It's all grain for me, naturally, Tim says. What got them interested was the price. Here in Australia, the price of beer has continually risen. That's another story, he says. Combine this with cost of living, and most people are struggling to afford $50 Australian for a carton of 24 beers, let alone prices for craft. A supermarket chain here sells a lager extract kit for $11 Australian, which is equivalent to 2 cartons. As far as my less than discerning in-laws care, that's damn good value. Could that be a way, therefore, that we get more brewers by explaining the money-saving aspect? Granted, there is a small upfront cost for equipment, but that pays off pretty quickly, particularly when serving from fermenters is cheap these days. I know I certainly spend far less on craft beer after starting to brew myself over the last year. Obviously, the cheap extract kits may not produce the most glorious of our lovely beverage, but it would at least introduce the idea. They can always be converted and blow all their cash on stainless steel and all grain like the rest of us idiots over time. What do you think about that, Jordan? Getting people into home brewing by starting them off with what sounds to me to be kind of the very, very most basic of extract kits.
Well, I do think that that's not the worst way to get someone interested in the hobby. I don't know if you saw these new more beer kits that claim that you can make a beer without even boiling it at this point. And so I think that that's a really good way to kind of tiptoe into the hobby. That's a natural place to start because you don't want to overwhelm someone with pH meters and water chemistry and stuff like that. But I think that once you get there, you're making better beer. But I wanted to comment on this comment related to it's a way to save money. And I've actually heard this in the Australian context before. And so I don't know that that necessarily applies the same in the United States. Although, beer ain't free, I think that it's more heavily regulated and higher cost in places like Australia and perhaps Canada. And so I think that in some of these countries with stronger sin taxes, there really might be a really strong economic argument there. And I also think it ties into culture. Like in a place like Germany where beer and water, are equally as precious. I don't think we have that culture here in America, and people don't need beer to survive. And so I think that you kind of need this confluence of like really expensive commercial offerings and a cultural necessity to make this economic argument, perhaps at the sacrifice of quality, really make a lot of sense. And I don't know that that necessarily holds up here in the States.
Yeah, there are so many different things we could comment on Tim's feedback here. Like you said, it's kind of a joke here in the United States, at least, that home brewing is going to save you money on beer. And the joke there is that you're going to end up spending so much money on gear and upgrades and doing all the fun stuff you do in a hobby that it's more than going to make up for what you might have spent on craft beer if that's all you were interested in. Here's the thing. I've calculated it. There is a point to kind of a tipping point to where homebrewing actually did start saving me quite a bit of money. Of course, that was after all of the costs associated with building my system kind of paid itself off. But, you look at a 5-gallon batch of beer, which is, what's that? Between 40 and 45 bottles of beer, if you want to look at it that way. You can brew that for $35, maybe let's call it $40, accounting for the energy costs, right? That's a lot of beer for $40. Now, craft beer, of course, I can go down to my local grocery store here and get a case of Miller Lite for $21 for 36 cans. Obviously, you're not going to beat that. That's going to be tough to beat, even if you're trying to make, American light lager. So there is that. Now, without a doubt, the price of craft has absolutely gone up over the last few years, which is one of the reasons I think we're seeing less people spending their money on it. It's a really obvious barrier to entrance, not only into beer drinking, but into beer brewing, I think, because if you're not drinking it, why would you go and start brewing it? But like you said, Tim, it may also be good reason for some people to decide to take up home brewing. I mean, again, why not make 5 gallons of beer for the same price I'd spend 3 or 4 pints on 3 or 4 pints, at the pub? I think the problem we run into here, though, is the quality. Like you mentioned, Tim, when I go to my favorite brewery, I can be somewhat confident, at least, that I'm getting a predictably decent product. Whereas if I'm making it myself, especially if I'm not that experienced, there's a much higher risk that that beer is going to taste not very good, at least when compared to the commercial stuff. So that said, I do think the joy of making something like a batch of beer at home is rewarding enough in itself to keep people doing it. But they've got to be the right people. They've got to be the people who aren't just after a tasty beer for as little coin as possible. Either way, I think it's rad of you to keep the passion alive with your family members by introducing them to the hobby. And who knows, maybe one day they're going to be taking home medals and maybe even making better beer than what you're making for them now with those extract kits. So thank you so much for the email, Tim. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Alrighty, time for a quick break. When we return, we're going to be discussing Jordan's experiences building a farmhouse ale program and sharing our views on some of the beers he brewed and shared with me. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. I've mentioned before the fact that my wife is Latvian. Both sides of her family have deep roots in the country of Latvia, which sits between Estonia and Lithuania on the Baltic coast. She was, in fact, the first generation American, and in order for her to keep that culture alive and teach younger generations about their heritage, a group of older Latvians, her grandparents, in fact, built a camp in the small town of Shelton, Washington over 50 years ago. And my wife spent every summer of her childhood going to this camp, and now our kids go there as well. While we hang out for the week to assist the directors, it's a lot of fun for the whole family. Now, since we now live in California, we've opted to make an annual road trip up north, during which we pass through Portland, Oregon. And who lives in Portland? Jordan does. So this year on the drive up, which wasn't even a month ago at this point, Jordan and I met up. He shared all of the beers he had on tap with me, which was so much fun. And then as I was getting ready to leave, you gave me a box filled with bottles of stuff from your Farmhouse Wild Funky Sour program, Jordan. As soon as I arrived to camp, I put those bottles on ice, and over the following week, I shared them with my buddy, Tagi Holmquist, who he and I kind of share, we'll call it Mr. Fix-It duties at the camp for the week. Now, of course, I wrote down some notes to share with you, Jordan, which is what we're going to be getting into here in a minute. But before that, why don't you tell us a little bit about the generals of your farmhouse ale journey?
Sure. So a lot of home brewers, there were these styles that I was super interested in tasting that my access was somewhat limited relative to kind of standard pub beers at the time, like amber ales and pale ales and stuff like that. And so I just went kind of whole hog and, read everything I could. Farmhouse ales by Murkowski, American Sour Beers by Tonsmeyer, and just started toying around with it. And, what became a lark quickly became a full-blown program. And, you've seen my basement. And, once you pop, you just can't stop because, you're making all these different threads to blend together. And it's like, I've won quite a few awards, and it's like, I think I'm onto something here, and I just can't let it go. So I just constantly am brewing different, various wild, funky, sour things, and then you blend them together. Just this morning, I just walked back with an entire crate of peaches from the farmer's market near my house, and after this pod, I'm gonna start pulling a blend together and start aging on peaches. And so it's just really fun to have something that's kind of like more creative and free spirited. And just at the end of the day, you're trying to make beers that are funky, sour, or wild, or some variations of the three. And it's just a really nice bit of relief from the more overly technical German lager style brewing that I also do on every other week. To have this kind of just truly open palette to play with various threads of different, beer styles that are ostensibly in the farmhouse tradition.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier that my wholehearted belief that we should operationally define something. To keep this podcast title simple, we're calling the umbrella term we're using is Farmhouse Ale, but that includes, wild, naturally inoculated, sour beer, all that kind of fun stuff. When I said earlier that I view this style or these styles of beers as being some of the most exciting to drink, what I meant by that wasn't necessarily that they're my absolute favorite, though some of them could be. What I mean is that they are so unique from batch to batch. There's always some possibility of variation or something new happening. And I just think being able to make those at home in our garage / sour showers as I used to use when I was making sour beer, it is so fun. And you're putting all of this time mostly into waiting for that beer to get ready, that when you get to sample them, even if your friend is giving you bottles to sample, there's something so romantic about doing that, about, thinking back to when this beer was made, what the intentions were in making this beer, what the brewer thinks about them. And that's exactly what we're going to be getting into today. I'm super excited to hear your thought process on what was it, 6 or 7 beers that you gave me to try, to talk about all of the different things that you were thinking as you went into brewing these beers. First off, I want to thank you for sharing them with me though, Jordan, because that was pretty rad of you.
Well, I'm excited to get your feedback because this is truly, the first time I'm hearing it live on air.
Well, and on that note, it's very easy. I think most people listening to this have experienced their friends and maybe parents telling them that everything they do in brewing is perfect and they should start a brewery. I have that pull as well. And so you and I talked about it before pressing record, Jordan. I am going to do my best to be a little bit more nitpicky than I might normally be, only because I do have some questions about some of the processes that were involved in making all of these beers. So why don't we start off with the first beer that you shared with me? I know that you had an order you kind of wanted to go in talking about these. So why don't you introduce the first beer with us?
Yeah, so I think we're going to go in order of kind of more standard to a little bit more inventive and then into the sour and fruited realm. And I wanted to start with a Belgian Saison. And this is really this is the workhorse of my Farmhouse program, is making simple, refreshing, dry, bitter, enjoyable Saisons that I can both bottle condition and enjoy as a Saison, but then tinker with and maybe add something to it, like Brett or dry hops or something like that. But in addition, having a clean source of dry stock to blend with the incredibly acidic sour beer stock that I have on hand that needs a ton of fresh, clean, normal pH beer to get it into balance when achieving the subsequent sour blend. And so what you got to try was the straight Saison that actually is used in other fruited sour beers that I have on hand, but you got to try straight from the source, just a Saison. So this is a really standard kind of Saison recipe. Those that want to brew Saison, or those that brew it often, know that there's really no hard and fast rules. It's not 100%, roasted malt or something like that. But generally speaking, pale malt, Pilsner malt, a little bit of wheat, don't use wheat, doesn't really matter. So this one was 87% extra pale Pilsner by Weyermann, 9% wheat malt by Weyermann. And then I actually used a little bit of dextrose to get the gravity up because I had lower efficiency than planned. And that's just a little bit of Warrior and Tettnang at 60, 30, and 5 to get us 29 IBUs. And that dried out down to, I think, 1005 or maybe 1004, and starting gravity of 1050. So we're looking at about 6% Saison. So really just kind of middle of the road, no frills, just Farmhouse Saison. What do you think?
Yeah. So before I get into my review, I've got a couple disclaimers, but then I also have some questions as well. First off, this was by luck of the draw. This happened to be the very first beer that Tagi and I opened up, and it was 2 days after you gave them to me because I wanted them to be nicely chilled and settled, just in case there was some stuff at the bottom of the bottle. First off, you refer to this as a Belgian Saison, and we know that Saison, I believe at least, originated from the region of Belgium that is highly influenced by France as well. In your mind, is there a difference in when you're approaching, for example, this, which it sounds to me like it's kind of your base pale Saison style, beer that you're going to play around with even more so. what is your thinking like a comparison between a Belgian Saison and other types of Saison, or do you even distinguish them?
That's a good question. I think for me, when I think of Saison, air quotes, it is not sour, it's not funky. And you'll see some commercial breweries that use that throw that term around haphazardly. And that's the beauty of Farmhouse Brewing, is there's really no hard and fast rules. But in my program, Saison means it doesn't have Brett, it doesn't have some sort of lactic acid bacteria, etc. That being said, I do think there's a difference between Belgian and French Saison, specifically in terms of the yeast choice. I'm not a huge fan of French Saison yeasts in the grand scheme of their, relative differences to Belgian strains. I find that the Belgian strain just has a different, more pleasing balance of phenols and esters that I like better. It's just a little more complex. And so I had omitted that, but I should say critically that this is my house culture of Imperial's Rustic. So the one that you tasted was probably the 5th generation or so for that particular strain.
So that was going to be my next question, is because it seems like you and I think about Saison similarly, that there are, variations. They're not terribly vast, but I do have more of a preference for, say, the kind of more classic, really dry and not thin in the mouth, but that crisp, easy drinking mouthfeel. In my experience, the French style Saisons, which I'm really, I'll be honest, defining mostly by beers that are fermented with the French Saison strain, which is Imperial Yeast Napoleon. I forget the number associated with Y Yeast's version of that, where my understanding is it has a higher tendency to produce glycerol, which kind of, increases the mouthfeel in the body, at least on the palate. And that's just not something that I've had great beers fermented with those strains. Don't get me wrong. But my preference, I'm going to kind of lean into that drier, crisper, lighter mouthfeel, because it just makes for a more refreshing sip for me. So that was my first question. I wanted to get that out of the air. Now, I'm really curious to hear what you did in terms of inoculation, whether it be with lab yeasts, natural inoculation, sour stuff, dregs, whatever that is for each of these beers, because we did not talk about that before. That's another thing I want to get out there. We didn't talk about any of your process when you gave me these bottles. You just gave me a box of bottles, said, I'm excited to hear your notes, and then we had the idea to talk about it on the show. So that's where we're at right now. To get it out there, Jordan, I loved this beer. It was the first one I opened, and it did that thing where as I was pouring it, I could smell this like toasty, crackery malt aroma coming off out of the glass. I was pouring it close to my face. I was outside sitting under the trees with the sunlight shining through the top of the pine tree. It was such a great experience drinking this. And having it be the first one, my hopes were high. We'll put it that way. It had all of the characteristic Saison fermentation notes that I would expect, but it did not cover up. Sometimes you have Belgian style beers where the esters and phenols kind of overwhelm every other aspect of the beer. And in this case, at least to my palate, it didn't do that. It was so well balanced and absolutely delicious.
And I'm thinking back to the brew day here, and I recalled I pitched like a vodka shot sized of yeast slurry. And so I don't know if that's an extreme under pitch or not, but the intention was a lower pitch rate to really drive those phenols and esters. And it just really goes to show, watch, our Brewlosophy show on YouTube about, harvesting and repitching yeast. It's really not that hard to do. And especially with like a Saison strain, a contamination you might not even be able to tell because it's just so characterful in the first place. But as far as I can tell, this yeast is really doing a great job several generations later and continues to make really impressive, dry, crispy, peppery Saison beers.
So how old was this bottle, give or take a few weeks, I suppose, when you shared it with me?
Maybe in the bottle 2 or 3 months. And I should say that every beer that we're going to talk about today was bottle conditioned with, sugar. And in the case of the sour beers, I also re-yeast those as well.
Okay, and then they were also stored on a shelf in your basement. These were not refrigerated until I put them on ice, right?
That is correct. I just have too many beers in the cellar here to keep them all cold. And I found that when it comes to bottle conditioned farmhouse brews, they hold up just fine at cellar temps for multiple years. I think a saison is going to start to not taste as fresh, maybe a year out or something like that, compared to like a fruited sour beer, which can really hold on for a long time. But these things have a bit of shelf life in them, I think.
Oh, without a doubt. It's one of the unique things about saison in general, in my opinion, is, I can go down to the Total, and I know people will disagree with this, but I could go down to Total Wine and grab, a green bottle of Saison DuPont or something. And as long as it hasn't been sitting in the sunlight for too long, it might have some dust on it, but it's still going to be refreshing and good. Maybe not as good as it was, right off the boat, so to speak, but it's still going to be good. This beer, the Belgian Saison that you gave me, again, the carbonation was just spot on. It was spritzy, but didn't do that thing where it just bubbles up in your mouth and then washes away like nothing was ever there. It was so fully flavored with that nice balance. Very, very refreshing. It happened to be absurdly warm when we showed up to Shelton this year. I think at the time when Tagi and I were drinking this beer, we opened it at like 4:00 p.m. and it had dropped down to like 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which were right by a lake. It was humid, and this just hit the spot. Now, Tagi, again, this is a guy who's not necessarily a nut when it comes to craft beer. He really enjoyed this one as well. This was one of the bottles that you gave me that even my, Miller Lite drinking buddy was very, very happy with drinking, drank his whole sample. The bottle was empty by the time we were done. So excellent job on that one. Now, was the other beers that you gave me, at least maybe as we go through it, you can let us know whether or not this Belgian Saison was the base for those ones or not.
Yeah, sure. So the next one was a New Zealand Saison, which was recently featured on the website as a BIY, brew it yourself, New Zealand Saison. And this was my first time using this particular hop combo in the Saison format. And really the thinking here was, I guess it's kind of a series within a series that I've been doing these New Zealand Saisons. And I've just found that New Zealand hops work really well with this Imperial Rustic, which is rumored to be from De Blaugies, which is rumored to be from DuPont. And so somewhere in that classic Belgian Saison realm lies Rustic. And something about it, the way that it interplays with these kind of tropical fruit-forward New Zealand hops, it works. And so I had been really getting a kick out of these Rawaka focused IPAs and West Coast Pilsners I've been making, and getting almost like it has this really strong, like what I describe as diesel funk, to the point where it could be off-putting to some that it's definitely a divisive hop. And I thought, it almost has this like green bottle vibe that you get in green bottles of Saison DuPont. And I was like, why don't we bring the two together and see if we can get like a quasi light struck character that Rawaka provides without actually light striking the beer. And so very similar grist to what I described in the last one. But instead this time it's using Motueka and Rawaka, including, and so it was about 8 IBUs of Motueka at 60 minutes, and then another 25 IBUs or so of Motueka and Rawaka and the hop stand following the flame out. And that's it. And then fermented with Rustic. I didn't really talk too much about fermentation, but with these beers, I like to start about 65, and I'll often just do foil as the airlock on the carboy or the keg that I'm fermenting in, just to get it started, because there's fears of stalling. Notably, the Rustic strain is less prone to stalling, and maybe there's some ester formation or something that's more preferable or desirable that way. Then I close it off and finish under an airlock as normal, and then ramp up to like 75 or so, 80 maybe is the finishing temperature, because I like to start lower to not just blast it with phenols or fusels or anything like that. And ultimately, it made a really tropical beer that I thought was really enjoyable. But interestingly, as I say in the article, it didn't get that diesel funk, which I'm concluding must be a function of dry hopping, and that Rawaka and the hop stand alone isn't going to give you as much of that quasi light struck character. So even though I didn't have that present, I still thought it was a really enjoyable, refreshing, and kind of tropical spin on the Saison.
So before I get into my thoughts on this beer, I was trying to put a timeline together here. 11 or 12 years ago, I think, a local homebrewing buddy of mine, Wes, made a Saison. He fermented it with the popular French Saison strain. That was right around the time where the French Saison strain was kind of blowing up in popularity among homebrewers. And he hopped the whole thing and then dry hopped it heavily with an American hop. I'm going to let you guess what it is, Jordan. That is also known for having a kind of a diesel funk. You have an idea what that might be? Blueberry is often associated with it.
Mosaic?
Mosaic. And this saison, he called it a Mosaic saison, and it blew my mind. I did not know you could get that kind of a flavor in a saison that is otherwise, fairly traditional with the exception of the hopping. And as you were talking about your New Zealand saison, I mean, that was exactly what kind of rang in my mind as I was drinking it. Holy hop bomb. And I don't even know how much of what I was detecting as hops or fruitiness came just from the hops, but I do think that there is this magical thing that can happen when you pair certain types of hops with certain types of fermentation character that just creates this like symbiotic, crazy fruitiness that maybe wouldn't be there if the two weren't together, if that makes sense. This beer was just so much fun for me to drink. And honestly, I kind of overanalyzed it a little bit, if that makes sense. As soon as I popped the cap on this bottle, without even pouring it out, you could smell the New World hops. I mean, it just made its way right to my nose, and that only intensified as I started pouring it into my little aluminum solo cup. I was camping, so that I'm okay with that. The hops definitely took center stage in this beer, but that's not to say that it totally stole the show, in my opinion. It was obvious the beer was fermented with a characterful saison strain, which I felt, again, just served to further emphasize that fruitiness from the Riwaka hops. What's interesting to me, when I was out in New Zealand, 2018, 2019, all of the talk among the local brewers there was Riwaka. And I'm going, man, that has not popped yet. I mean, everybody in America kind of knows about it and has heard about it, but it's not, it didn't take, the stage by storm, kind of like Citra or some other of the more common hops did. But nowadays I'm hearing a lot more about it. I mean, it seems like we've caught on, and man, Riwaka is a pungently fruity hop out there, and it did wonders, in my opinion, for this beer. Like the first saison, I still got a really nice crackery malt note, mostly in the finish though, kind of that organoleptic breathing out of my nose. I could really pick up more of that malt. But again, the hops were just front and center, and it was delectable. I loved this beer so much, Jordan.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, especially for people that aren't like craft beer nerds that understand, most of them, frankly, don't know what the word saison means, right? And so you're like, have you had a Belgian beer? They're like, maybe,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
This is nice because it's like, if you're not familiar with saison or Belgian beers, which have a radically different flavor profile due to the fermentation of these specific, phenolic off flavor positive yeast strains and diastaticus, drying it out. An average Miller Lite drinker or IPA drinker, this might be a pretty wild brew for them. And I like the New Zealand saison because it's kind of like an introduction to farmhouse ales for them. It's like, well, IPA, right? Oh yeah, I love IPA. So this is like a Belgian IPA kind of. And
Yeah.
Between you and me, it's not really necessarily Belgian IPA, but now that I think about it, it maybe would compete well under that subcategory. But it's like, it gives them something familiar, IPA type hops, but in this kind of Belgian expression, and I think it just works.
I wonder to what extent the way my brain wraps its kind of understanding around certain styles is based on what they're called. Because back when people were trying to make Belgian IPA a thing, I didn't have one that I necessarily enjoyed, but I've always liked hoppy saison. So, what's the difference there? It might be smaller than it is, in real life. In my mind, I'm thinking it's vast, but maybe it's not. Regardless, I thought this beer was great. And maybe that was because of the New Zealand hops. Maybe if you had made it with Cascade and Citra, it wouldn't have tickled my palate the way that this one did. Now, as you mentioned, Tagi, my buddy who I was sharing this with, he drank it, and one of the comments he made was, this is like fruit juice in a glass. I mean, it is that fruity. And it kind of confused his palate a little bit, right? Because he's expecting beer flavor, which the Belgian saison really was beery, and this was so incredibly pungent in that fruity hop thing that I could see how it might be kind of confusing to the less initiated, as it were. Again, whatever you did in this one, and I'm imagining this one was sitting around for a few months on the shelf as well, you would never have been able to tell. The hop pungency in this was just right there, right in your face.
Yeah, something about bottle conditioning these hoppy saisons, it really preserves it well. Quite a bit better than maybe like a standard kegged from the bottle batch of like IPA or something, as you have experienced. That old IPA thing, when it sits out too long at room temp, somehow this is like preserving against that.
It's wild because you would never have guessed that this beer was any older than 3 or 4 weeks from the fermenter. I mean, it was just so freaking hoppy. Now, remind me again, did you dry hop this New Zealand Saison?
I did not on this batch because there's just so many ways to skin the cat on this stuff. And I was like, well, I'll just be a little simpler and forego the dry hopping step. And I really enjoy it, but I kind of regret not like doing a split batch. There was one that I didn't. The last time I did this New Zealand Saison, I did it 3 ways. I did the whole batch and it was all Nelson. And then I bottled some straight. I dry hopped the other half, and then I bottled half of that dry hopped, and then the other half maybe I added Brett in the bottle, or maybe I added Brett and like aged it out a little bit longer before packaging, and I can't remember because it was a while ago. And so I had this like kind of horizontal of like straight Nelson, dry hop Brett Nelson, and each one was so fantastic in its own way. And that dry hop really adds an extra punch, which I kind of miss in this. But, there's also beauty and simplicity, and not everything doesn't have to be 11 out of 10.
Yeah, that's right. 10 out of 10 is acceptable, right? Well, speaking of dry hop, the third beer that we're going to discuss. Now, again, I did not drink these in the order that we're talking about then, and I'm trying to be cognizant of that because I know that can kind of impact your perception. I kind of geeked out on this one. We would open a bottle and then go do some work, maybe have a Miller Lite or something, and then come back and drink these beers. The dry hop sour ale wasn't even drank. We didn't consume this on the same day even as the New Zealand Saison. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about this one? I have to imagine that the process for making this was a bit different than the Saisons.
Yes. So now we're getting into blending. So may she rest in peace, the Rare Barrel, one of the great American sour brewers that is now defunct, had been making these dry hop sours that really were blowing me away. My buddy lived in Berkeley at the time, and he was a member of their ambassadors club. And so we had this really sweet little trade deal where he would give me one of everything that he got out of the club, because they got like 2 or plus bottles of each release, in return for the sour beers that I was making in my Farmhouse program. So I had the luxury of trying all of the Rare Barrel's beers over the course of the 3 or so years he was in the program, and these dry hopped ones were really blowing me away. So their brew team was the featured guests on a live episode of the Sour Hour. Remember that old podcast?
Oh yeah.
And I wrote in with the question, how are you making these dry hop sour beers? What's the secret? And I was really intrigued. They took my question on air, that it's not as simple as you'd think. You don't just take sour beer, dry hop it, and package it. They tried that, and they said they were getting dill pickle results. And through experimentation, they found you need to dry hop clean beer and then blend the dry hopped, Saison or something in with the sour threads at packaging to get that beautiful tropical, dry hop expression without the dill pickle brine. And so that's what I did here, and that's what I do with my dry hop sour ale series. Is I'll make a standard Saison just like the ones we were just talking about, and then dry hop the heck out of it. And so that was the recommendation: is that you're going to dry hop your clean thread. And I keep saying threads. For those that don't know, that's one industry term for like different barrels. So like thread A could be a Saison, thread B could be like a sour blonde or something. And you want to dry hop your clean thread at the rate that you're shooting for the overall blend. So for example, if you wanted a 5 ounce dry hop in a 5 gallon batch, so 1 ounce per gallon, and you're only going to blend in, let's just say for the sake of argument, 2.5 gallons, half of clean beer, then you would add all 5 ounces to those 2.5 gallons that you're dry hopping. So this was using Nectaron hops. As you know, I've taken a fancy to those, and I thought this sounds like the perfect hop for a dry hop sour ale because of its just incredible tropical fruit, passion fruit. It's an incredible hop. And especially in terms of its like tropical fruit expression. And so I made a clean Saison and dry hopped the heck out of it. And then did that in pressure in a keg, so to kind of mitigate any sort of oxygen exposure. And then with that method, I'm able to use CO2 and close transfer it out into the bottling bucket. And this is actually another little trick I use is in my bottling bucket, I bubble CO2 in it through a oxygenation stone, but that I rig it up to my CO2 thing so that it maybe ostensibly I'm helping ward off some of the oxygen exposure that's happening. But, our insurance comes back with that bottle conditioning phase. So to reiterate, this is a blend of dry hopped clean Saison that was dry hopped to the moon with Nectaron, blended with some basic sour blonde stock to achieve a moderate pH of like 3.5 or so that it still has the, sour beer experience, but in a more drinkable kind of farmhouse style where you're able to actually drink a glass, not just like have a little sample because it's ripping the enamel off your teeth. That was the intention. And I'm curious if what I'm describing lived up to your experience.
So I remember back when the sour beer thing, Mike had just written his book and sour beer was kind of blowing up in the homebrew world. And there was a lot of talk about comparing American sour beer, that you might find at the brewery or Russian River to classic Belgian sour beer, which, you can't talk about sour beer without talking about Cantillon. And there are very prominent differences between the two, in my opinion and my experience, right? You've got American sour beer, which is known for being a bit more assertively tart, whereas the Belgian sour beers, for the most part, at least the ones that I've tried, they have some acidity, but it is much more defined by this complex, funky, very unique kind of barnyardy, fruity thing if it's fruited. And I never really took I never chose one that I liked more necessarily because I think I appreciate both versions of sour beer, particularly the history behind, traditional Belgian sour beer. Right off the bat, I'll let you know, Jordan, that your sour beer brewing makes me think hugely of the traditional Belgian style and is not nearly as similar to some of the more modern American style sour beers that I'm familiar with here. So that played a little bit into my review of this one. Now, I've only ever had a few dry hopped sours in my day. I believe the last one, in fact, was like 5 years ago during a visit to Russian or Rare Barrel when I was in the Bay Area visiting my sister and brother-in-law. So it's not a style that I'm super familiar with. So my, perspective of this beer is you got to take it with a grain of salt because it's based on that. Now, to me, your dry hop sour beer leaned a bit more, like I said, it leaned a bit more into that funky, earthier side of things rather than the tartness I think a lot of American drinkers associate with, quote, sour beer. Or maybe they just expect that like I do, I guess. But man, was this complex. And, the hop character was definitely present. It did not overwhelm the beer. You called it a dry hopped sour beer. And to my palate, yeah, there was hops in it, more so than you would get from a standard base, sour blonde ale. But it was so well balanced that it didn't strike me as like overly hoppy. It didn't fool my mind into thinking I was drinking a pale ale or an IPA or anything like that, because the other parts of that beer that made it so complex are really what my brain went to. And the dry hops were like the supporting character that just made it a fun thing to drink. Again, you're going to hear me say that a lot because I have fun drinking these styles of beer. I definitely enjoyed it. I did wonder, like, what would my thoughts be if this was more, if it had gone the direction of, the brewery or these more modern kind of highly acidic sour beer breweries these days. I bet it would be just as good. I bet I would have liked it just as much as what my notes say, but I really enjoyed what I felt was that kind of more traditional spin on an American sour beer that was dry hopped. Again, excellent job. I'm going to say that on every beer, obviously, but yeah, I really enjoyed this one as well.
Yeah, and now that I think about it, those dry hop sour beers from the Rare Barrel, they were great, but they were very sour.
Yes.
And
yes.
I intentionally wanted to dial that back a little bit because I find that, it's still a sour ale measurably, right? But I wanted to just make it a little bit more drinkable. And so it was just a little bit more refreshing instead of like this really intense like sample that you can kind of inspect for a second, but can't actually enjoy a whole bottle of.
Yeah. Well, and what I thought was pretty interesting, at the very least, if not kind of funny, was I'm drinking it expecting tart sour, and I didn't get it. Whereas my buddy Toggy is sitting next to me, and he takes his first sip, and I look over, and it looked like he'd put a warhead in his mouth. So that expectation, right, is like I've got, not only was my expectation towards the more warhead style sourness, but I've had a lot of sour beer, and Taghi had not. And so to him, this was a far cry from beer. He struggled to drink this one because of how funky and sour it was. In fact, I ended up taking half of his sample back and drinking it myself because I liked it so much. But yeah, it was, I think you did a really good job of melding kind of modern with traditional flavor characteristics in this one. And I do believe that the Nectaron was just a prime example of a good hop variety to use in a style like this, right? Because there are some hops I just don't think are gonna blend well with higher acidity, a little bit more funk, and stuff like that. Nectaron was just so well, it just fit in so well in this beer. So excellent job.
Yeah, thanks. And it's aging really gracefully. It's been in the bottle, maybe a bottle at the beginning of the year of 2024. So, at this point it's got some age on it, but it's holding up, and it's, kind of transforming into a new, kind of experience, not quite as dry hop forward, but it's still there. The intangibles, I think, are still hanging on.
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, I can't imagine that I'm the only one who learned something new when you were telling us about the way you made this, in that I would never have thought to dry hop the clean beer and then blend that with the sour beer. So listeners out there, if you're looking to make a quality dry hopped sour beer, hopefully you learned something from that. We do have to take a quick break. We're going to be right back with more talk of Jordan's experience brewing farmhouse ales and my experience drinking them. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the exGEERience Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the exGEERience Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every exGEERience comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exGEERience.com today. All the way back in 2003, just months before I got married and moved from Bellingham, Washington to where I live today in Fresno, California, my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, who, not much a fan of beer, brought over a bottle of something a friend told her was, quote, actually pretty good. Now, her friend wasn't much of a beer drinker either. You could probably guess what I'm referring to here. Lindemans Creek. For some reason, that brand, that beer landed on every store shelf in the early 2000s that we went into, and it was, I feel like marketed towards the non-beer drinking crowd who like fruitier things, sweeter things. Now, this was the first beer made with cherries that I'd ever had. I was in my early 20s. I started brewing, but I had never even thought about moving into fruited or sour beers. And while I did think it was maybe a little bit too sweet for my liking, it did open my eyes to this idea of fruited sour beers. Now, Jordan, a couple beers you gave me were made with cherries. Let's start with the first, which I believe you said you used. Did you use fresh cherries in it, or?
Yeah. So I think actually all the fruited sour beers that we're going to talk about today used fresh fruit. That is really my preference. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I just got back from the farmer's market this morning with some fresh peaches. I find that the real whole fruit has just such an incredibly potent, authentic, real fruit flavor that the purees just can't match.
Yeah, I agree. I've used puree before in the past for sour beer as well as for clean beer, and they work great. Don't get me wrong. They're very, very accessible. They're easy. They're a little bit more expensive than fresh fruit in my experience, but they work. There's something that you get from using fresh fruit, like you said, Jordan, that really lends that impression of freshness to a beer.
And complexity, right? And so the purees are pasteurized, and so that really makes a lot of sense in a wit beer or a wheat beer or even a kettle sour that you've already pasteurized through following the boil of the acidified wort. You're not trying to introduce additional potential sources of like wild microbes, but with traditional farmhouse brewing, we're embracing it. And so although I might rinse the cherries with some water, I'm not boiling them or doing anything to actually pasteurize them. So ostensibly, they might be contributing some additional wild character. And if that's the case, it certainly was on full display in the cherry sour ale I gave you.
So about your cherry, now this was a very pretty beer. It did have the color you would associate with a cherry beer. And most of the cherry sours that I've seen, I've had a lot of Creek and different versions of sour beer that was, dosed with cherries. I think that's a common fruit for sour beer brewers. I've made one even, this is something I'm not terribly unfamiliar with, but most have had a flavor that I typically associate with like a frozen icy or like a cherry popsicle. But this beer didn't have that. What it tasted like to me, I don't know what cherries you used, and if you know the exact varietal that you use, I'd love to hear it. But where I live here in California, a very, very popular cherry, we've got orchards around us, is the Tulare cherry. It's a really dark red, almost burgundy colored cherry that is very sweet and just richly flavored like cherry, and it's so good. This beer tasted like that to me, and almost to the point of not really tasting like beer, which isn't a complaint. That cherry character from those fresh cherries was just so strong. The obvious star of the show in this beer, at least to my palate, and it was so good. It didn't quite pass that threshold of like tasting like a cherry soda, and you've had beers like that or a cherry, some sort of a cherry drink. It still had some beery notes, but the cherry was without a doubt in the spotlight. And I thought it was just lovely. It was very, very delightful, fun to drink, not too sweet, though it did give you kind of that dessert style of experience in the mouth. At least it did to me. I didn't pick up any hop notes from this one. And the fermentation character I'm sure it was there. I'd be curious to hear what you fermented and inoculated this one with. But it allowed the cherry to really take the stage. And I thought that was really fun.
Yeah, and so what's kind of fun about the beers that you tasted in this series, they actually are all drawing upon similar threads, just of different ages and different, extra additions like different fruits and stuff. And so I talked a little bit about the Saison production thread in the prior segment, but I didn't really hit too hard on the sour component. And so what I do is I brew some very simple sour stock wort, so something like 60% Pilsner, 40% wheat, maybe 4 IBUs from like Sots at the beginning of the boil. And then I have a house culture that I've developed over the years that's got contributions from like bootleg biology and the yeast bay. No lambic cultures, though, are present there. And so you mentioned earlier that you think that there's a fundamental difference in the flavors between Belgian beers. And I assume that you were talking specifically about spontaneous beers like lambic. And American sour beers. And that's because a spontaneous fermentation has microbes that just simply aren't present in the lab cultures that contain lacto, pedio, Brett, and Saccharomyces. And I don't remember the various microbes that are present off the top of my head. They're long Latin-sounding words. But at the end of the day, they make a dramatically different tasting beer. And so I'm in the strong opinion that lambic is not necessarily sour beer is not inherently lambic, and it's not fair to conflate the two. And I have a bone to pick with you and Martin, because in a recent episode, he was saying that he brewed this lambic and talking about the lacto and pedio he pitched, and I'm like screaming at my computer. I'm like, that's not a lambic. You have to have spontaneous fermentation to call lambic, and they wouldn't even allow us to call it that in America. By the way, they reserve that appellation for Belgium. But nonetheless, these beers that you tried are in the more American style, where we're using laboratory pitches. I do have lambic style brews using a spontaneous approach. We'll save those for another podcast. So this blonde ale is very simple. You just make a really simple, 1040, 1050, doesn't really matter, base. It could be 100% Pilsner malt. It could be 100% wheat. It really doesn't matter. And then you're using hardy microbes from reputable sour-oriented labs like Yeast Bay and Bootleg Biology. And this is many generations down the line to the point where I probably need to start amping up my IBUs and my base wort, because this is the sour stock that I still have some left. I need to use so very little, because with the 4 IBUs and the hardiness of the culture that I used, the pH is below 2.9.
Oh my gosh. That's painful for anyone who doesn't understand what that's painful in your mouth. Yeah.
So the net effect is I have to blend in a ton of non-sour clean beer to achieve a reasonable pH balance. And so this cherry sour ale was, probably something in the 5-to-1 ratio of clean beer to sour beer blended on top of fresh farmers market cherries. You asked about the variety. I do not know. I didn't take note of it, but they're those really dark red ones in the Pacific Northwest. Do you think it's the same one you were describing?
I think Tullaris are grown up there as well. Yeah.
Okay. And I recall it was 17 pounds were used. And what I actually did was I washed them and then froze them because I wasn't quite ready for them, and I vacuum sealed them. And that is one trick that some people will do, is they claim that it helps break down the cell walls, improving or aiding in their re-fermentation. So I pulled them out a couple months later or whatever when I was ready to use them, ready for blending day, let them thaw in their vac seal bags in the sun, and then poured them in one of those giant, I think it's called Monster, the big wide mouth fermenters. They're really great for fruit beers because you have such a huge wide mouth. So that's a 7-gallon fermenter. So 17 pounds went in, and then the remaining beer threads went in. So probably somewhere in the 4-ish, 5-ish gallons, probably closer to 4. So the fruiting ratio was crazy high. And did you drink that out of that stainless steel glass?
Yeah.
So you couldn't see, it pours like black. It's so incredibly fruit forward to the point where I honestly think it needs more time. I'm looking at the notes here. It finished at 10.05 FG, which is kind of high for a fruited sour beer. And it also finished with a pH of 3.5, which was somewhat intentional. I like that more moderate pH for my sour beers, and they've fared well in competition, so I think there is something to not making it too sour. However, I think this one needs a little bit more acidity to balance the incredibly potent fruit character. At the very least, I think it needs more time for that to actually fade away some. So I'm excited to see how this one ages, because it's like drinking cherry juice. It is pretty intense.
Yeah, so I noticed how dark it was in pouring it. That was one of the things on my note. My notes just say very dark. But yeah, you're right. The cup I was using was not conducive to me getting a good visual, view of these things. A couple of things. First off, I just Googled the cherries grown in the Pacific Northwest. Chances are, it sounds like the most common dark sweet cherries that are grown up there are Bing, which are very popular, as well as something called Lambert. Both of them look kind of the same, but I know Bing cherries are very, very dark. So it may have been that variety that you used. Regardless, to me, Bing and Tulare taste insanely similar. I've actually had them side by side, which sounds weird. If you noticed in my initial review of this beer, I didn't say much about acidity or tartness or anything like that, because while I was drinking it, I kind of forgot that it was a sour beer. Like you said, the cherry was the most prominent feature in this beer. And, I think most people kind of associate cherries and fruit in general with having some level of acidity. And to me, I thought that maybe your intention was to make it more like a cherry juice, which is not going to be so sour that you notice the acidity. It's going to taste like a cherry and the acidity that you associate with a cherry. And on that level, I think you did an excellent job, because it did have that. It was like drinking a cherry juice with a little bit of like a toasted bread in the background was kind of my impression. But I'm with you. I think a little bit of time, allowing some of that cherry to fall off and more of the beer features to come up, and maybe even a little bit more of the beery acidity to shine a little bit would also work insanely well with this beer.
Yeah, because my anticipation is it might continue to acidify some in the bottle with those living, microbes continuing to chew on that. Hopefully it doesn't become overcarbed, because we didn't mention this earlier, but everything I gave you in all of my Farmhouse brewing is carbed as high as I can go. So this one was at 3.2. That Belgian Saison that I gave you, did it foam over at all?
Not a single beer foamed over.
That's good because I'm having some foaming problems on both the first beer that we talked about and the last beer we're going to talk about because they're just carved so incredibly high, and there could be, especially in the sour ones, could be some additional re-fermentation. But the intention there wasn't necessarily to make cherry juice. It was just that I found that bigger tends to be better when it comes to fruit additions and sour beer. And if you go too light, people are like, yeah, there's a little bit of peach background there, but go big or go home, right? And so I think 4 pounds per gallon is kind of a good starting point for heavily fruited sour beers. And you're going to get the fruit punch when you do that kind of level of fruiting. But with this particular variety of cherry, I think it was a little much. And I think that next time I would cut that by at least a third, just to make the beeriness shine through a little bit better. I think that I also on blending day should have added in some sour stock to lower the pH a little bit and water it down just a little bit because I think that a little more acidity or a little less fruit character is actually going to make that a better beer, which really is a good transition to the next beer.
Yeah, it really is. And this next beer is kind of an interesting one to me. And I have a feeling I know why you did it now after hearing you talk about the last one. I will say that it must have been a decade ago or more at this point. There was a brewery, I think it's called Lengthwise Brewing down in Bakersfield. My wife and I were driving up from LA, decided to stop for a beer on the way up, for me, just because I hadn't been there yet. And I'll never forget, I think it was blackberry or blueberry sour beer that they had made. And that beer just tasted like they squished up fruit and then strained out the seeds and served you the juice. And I wasn't a huge fan. And so that's always kind of the what I compare fruited sour beers to when they're super fruity. And yours wasn't that. That's what I want. The point I want to get across is that your sour cherry beer, it wasn't just fruit juice. You could tell it was well made. You could tell there was beer there. It was dry. It didn't have that viscosity of fruit juice, at least in my opinion, but it was insanely cherry forward. And I personally liked it. Would I drink pint after pint? I wouldn't drink 2 pints of fruit juice either, so probably not. But I do like that. I'm assuming you're thinking after drinking that beer was, I wonder what I can get away with if I leave these cherries here and just use them again, if it's going to contribute much. Tell us your thinking about this second use cherry sour ale that you made.
Yeah, so the next beer we're going to talk about is something I will frequently do when using whole fruit is, and this is a common trick in the sour beer brewing world, is there's still life in these fruits. When you're using whole, real fruit, and I don't know if that would necessarily be as desirable with like Costco frozen fruit, but at the very least with like real orchard fruit, there's often plenty left, especially with the fruiting levels I'm doing. And so I do this a lot of the time. And so I don't remember if it was so much that like as this was going into the bottling bucket, I was like, I definitely want to reuse these because of the intensity of the primary one, or if it was just the plan all along. But either way, I then blended more beer on top of those cherries for a second use cherry sour ale. And I actually have the notes here on this one. So there was about 7 liters of cherries at the bottom of the fermenter. And that's still going to have some of the original sour beer from the cherry sour we just talked about present in the fruit. So you have like almost like a sour starter, if you will, that's already present there. And I blended in 16 liters of Saison and then about 2 liters of my sour stock, which was measured at 2.66 pH prior to going into the blend. And aged that for probably like 3 months, and then bottled that. And I had one last night, and for my money, this is the better beer at this point in time. I think that it's more balanced. The acidity is nice, and I think that the fruit character is very strong, but not as overly strong as I'm getting in that primary cherry sour that we just talked about just a second ago. I think this is in a much better place at this time. It'll be interesting to see these two things age, because I think that there will be an inflection point when their first use cherry sour ale becomes the better drinking experience.
So when I was younger, I was at some camp or something like that, and there was this fun little trick, this game that the students at this camp would play, where one person's blindfolded, so that was me at one point, and people would describe one thing, and then the prank part of it, so they'd be describing something like a Snickers bar, right? And you're like, oh, I know what I'm going to be eating here, and then they would feed it to you, except they wouldn't. They would put something like a pickle in your mouth, and the experience of having the expectation expectation of sweet chocolate, nuts, and caramel, and then having a pickle or something like that, it's to the point of almost like disgust, where you're like, what is happening here? Whereas if they'd just described a pickle, I'd have been perfectly happy with it because I love pickles. So that was sort of my experience with this, and I wasn't disgusted with it, of course, but with the second use cherry sour ale that you gave me. So first off, Tagi and you had told me what the beers were. This was not like a blind tasting. We knew, I was very well aware that this was the second use cherry sour ale. So I very intentionally held off on drinking this beer for a whole day after drinking the cherry sour ale, the very pungently cherry one, because I did not want that experience of, oh man, where's the cherries in this? Because that last one was just so strong. So this was an interesting one for me. Like you said, the fruitiness was absolutely there. There was no denying that this was a fruited beer, but still, having had the other cherry beer, it's like my brain was just looking for that fruit juiciness, and this was way more beery. I too would drink this more than I would drink the other cherry beer, but I felt like it was almost like this was the cousin, and I didn't want to like one more than the other, I think as far as uniqueness and kind of excitement in drinking a beer, the first one was more fun on that level. But as far as drinkability and what I personally preferred, the second use cherry sour beer was kind of won that competition. As far as Tagi, he took one sip of the second use cherry beer and was like, I can't do this one. Not my thing. Again, I think more of the acidity came through and more of that kind of funkiness was present, and that can be really off-putting for people who aren't familiar with these styles of beers. Whereas the single use or the first use cherry beer that you gave me, it was just cherry, despite being somewhat similarly made as this one. So again, fun to drink a day after the other one, but definitely different.
Yeah, and I wish you could see them side by side in a clear glass too, because the cherry sour ale is almost like black, whereas the second use is very red, and also like more not as like turbid, if you will. Like the cherry sour ale is like just looking into like night. And then the second use is like the red, and you can kind of like start to see through it and stuff. So, but either way, I think it demonstrates that when using whole real fruit, you can totally make an incredible second use sour beer, given if your initial fruiting rates are high enough.
And I would imagine that is largely contingent on the type of fruit you're using. You look at like most berries, like raspberry and blackberry, stuff like that, are pretty pungent to where you could probably get away with it. Definitely cherry. I've heard things. I've never brewed with fresh strawberry. I've never brewed with strawberry. I don't really like strawberry beer, but I've heard some things that it's so light that you have to use a ton if you want to get any strawberry character. And then once you do that, you're probably best to just dump it and start with, new fresh strawberries. But in this case, the cherry absolutely came through. It was so much lighter. And my notes do say more red than I put that the first one looked blood red, and I put that this one was more pinkish red in my notes. And yeah, so it sounds like you and I are kind of on the same page in terms of the way it looks and generally presents. But I don't know if both of those beers were sitting in front of me, the first use sour and the cherry sour, and then the second use cherry sour, it would be, I'd probably just go back and forth until both bottles were empty, because I liked them both. They were just so different.
Yeah, now I'm thinking I need to open two bottles at the same time and do a blend.
I bet that'd be fun. Yeah.
But we have yet another component of this little horizontal, if you will, so with these sour beers, if you're going to bottle condition them, one, I would argue you should for two reasons. Who's going to drink 5 gallons of sour beer quickly, right? So it's really nice to put them in a bottle, because then you can have one once a month or something, and they're great gifts. I went to a party last night, and I brought a bunch, and I was a very popular person last night. Everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, these are so cool!" Because you can just like pour samples for everyone, and so I really like the bottle condition format, but if you're going to do that, there is a risk of no carbonation, what's known as terminal acid shock. And so the Rare Barrel really pioneered this method, the terminal acid shock starter. I don't think that it's up on their website anymore, because I think their website is gone. But it's basically two Play-Doh sugar water mixed with like 1 part of your sour beer that you aim to bottle the following day, with 2 grams per 5 gallons of CBC1 bottle conditioning yeast from Lallemand. And you're going to rehydrate that, and you're going to add that to your blend of 2 Plato sugar water with 1-to-1 with the sour beer that you aim to bottle. And you're going to let that ferment overnight. And what that's doing is it's acclimating your bottle conditioning yeast to an acidic environment. So it actually has the, survivability to subsequently carbonate that beer, because there's a concern that there's not enough live yeast cells in a long-term barrel conditioned or carboy conditioned, multi-year sour left to actually carbonate the sugar that consume the sugar that you're going to add at the bottling stage. So this is a really important piece of insurance, is to do this terminal acid shock starter to make sure that you're actually able to carbonate the beer properly in the bottle. So on the night that I pulled off a little bit of sour beer to make my terminal acid shock starter with the intention of bottling the second use cherry sour ale the next day, I pulled 1 gallon of that cherry sour ale out of the fermenter into a little 1 gallon carboy that I have, that I had grated and squeezed the juice of a single lime into that little gallon carboy. So I rinsed the lime, and I used like a potato peeler to pull big pieces of the rind off, so I didn't grate it into small little bits. And then I squeezed the juice into it, and then I racked that aged second use cherry sour ale onto that, and it sat for 24 hours before I bottled it, with the intention that this would be a cherry limeade sour. And woo-wee, it worked. What do you think?
So okay, so you used just 1 lime for the whole batch.
For 1 gallon of second use cherry sour ale the day before bottling, with 1 lime's juice and the rind.
Okay. So I will say this, that we opened this bottle it was the same day as the second use cherry beer. And in this one, we drank it. We opened up a Miller Lite, went and took care of some work we had to do at the camp pool, and then came back about 45 minutes later and popped this one open and shared it. So there's this sparkling water. I forget what brand it is. I'm not even sure if it's still being made, but they did, they were kind of known for like doing the fruit blends for their sparkling water. And there was one that was cherry lime, and it was my absolute favorite. So that probably influenced my expectations on this one. I did not get any lime from this beer. And I think part of it was that I was expecting so much, lime flavor and aroma that I kind of neglected the nuance of what could possibly be there. I picked something unique up. The cherry was way more dominant though to me than any citrus character, at least on my palate. And maybe that was influenced by the fact that I'd had this other cherry beer earlier. Was it a bad beer? No, it was probably my least favorite of the lot, only because, again, I didn't get as much of the cherry limeade kind of thing that I was expecting based on what it was called. But after hearing your process for making it, that kind of makes sense to me. It wasn't overwhelmingly limey. And so maybe that was just part of my expectation, but all in all, this was probably one of the more refreshing, to the extent that it was the most like a sparkling water to me. It didn't have as much, again, to my palate, didn't have as much malt character, didn't have as much hops. It was really just this nice semi-tart, kind of fruity drink that paired perfectly for the 90-degree day that we were, drinking it on.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I have to wonder if your stainless steel cup somehow had a dampening effect on the lime, because the beers that we just described, the first use cherry sour, second use cherry sour, and then the second use cherry sour limeade variant, my homebrew club drank those in the order that we just described. And once we got to the limeade one, everyone was like, woohoo, holy lime Batman. This lime totally is overpowering everything, and you've lost all nuance. This is way too limey. And I had one recently, and I think I enjoy it, but it is very lime forward in a balanced cherry limeade kind of way. And you are the only person who've ever said that they're not getting lime on this.
So I'm very, I mean, I like citrus. I use lime juice in many cocktails because I love it so much. I wonder, there's two things that come to mind. One is obviously palate fatigue, which I do not believe is the case here because I'd only had, with the exception of a couple Miller Lights, I'd only had that second use cherry sour that you gave me before drinking this. And it was separated by 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, neither Tagi nor I picked up a real prominent lime character to the point that I'm smelling it and looking at it going, what am I missing? Maybe it's possible that we grabbed the wrong bottle off the shelf, or because if you're getting such a pungent liminess from this beer and I'm not at all, usually I'd pick up citrus. I mean, that's not a difficult thing to perceive. It makes me wonder if maybe I was drinking something different. Regardless, what I did have was still very refreshing and light on the palate. That's one thing I remember is it didn't have that richness that some of the other beers had. This one was very, very light. My notes, I'm reading the notes I actually hand wrote here. It says like sparkling water light. And that was how, is that how you get, is that what you get from this beer in addition to the lime stuff that I didn't get? Or is there, I mean, maybe we're kind of hinting at I wasn't drinking the same beer or what?
Well, do you remember, was it a 12-ounce bottle? Because I think that was the only one that was a small 12-ounce bottle.
There was one 12-ounce bottle that we opened, yes. And I'm wondering if maybe that was this one.
Well, that would have been what it would have been. So, but either way, one thing that's notable here is these did ferment out way lower than the first use cherries. So I said the first use cherries went down to 10.05. These were more like 10.01 or so. So I do think that they're drier and spritzier and more refreshing, given that it's not as like thick of a cherry element. I think carbonated water is a bit of a stretch, but definitely when we're comparing it to the first use cherries, I would agree with the assessment. It's way lighter, way brighter, and way more drinkable in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, all of them were so well. That's the one thing I want to say about every single one of the beers that you gave me is the carbonation was so spot on for somebody who loves a nice sparkly carbonation. These really hit the spot on that. So my assessment, every single one was drinkable and good. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to not like something just because it looks like I'm pandering. I liked all of these beers. I'm really trying to nitpick here because to make the show interesting. This was the one where I was probably the most confused because of the limeade piece of it that I just wasn't getting. But now I'm wondering, maybe I'm not as sensitive to lime as I thought I was, or who knows? Still insanely refreshing though.
Right. So I think we got one more to talk about.
Absolutely. This is probably the most exciting one, if I may say so up front. So let's please talk about it. Yes.
All right. Well, continuing in my tradition of walking into the farmer's market, seeing what's fresh and just buying it and going for it. I saw one of the fruit stands was selling huckleberries. This would have been last harvest season, so like about a year ago today or so, and I knew of huckleberries, but was by no means an expert in them, and they're kind of a bit of a Pacific Northwest specialty, perhaps even, and they're like a blueberry cousin kind of thing, and you'll see huckleberry jam and huckleberry pie up here, and I was like, this sounds perfect. So this one is actually blended to Berliner strength. So I made a clean stock that was a lower alcohol, like 3.2, 3.5, and blended that clean stock with my sour thread, which again is very sour, and then did that on a ton of huckleberries. And so a really high fruiting rate, something in the 4 pounds per gallon fruiting rate. And one thing that you'll hear with blueberries, and so I can ostensibly translate that to huckleberries, is you really struggle to get a lot of potent flavor out of those. And I think that we experienced that here. This has obviously been in the bottle for quite a long time, since if I blended it on the fruit maybe a year ago. And it has faded some, but it was never as crazy, punch you in your face, huckleberry forward as like that first cherry sour beer we talked about. But it is there. But what you tried was actually a variant of the huckleberry experiment. And what I gave you was the Amberana huckleberry variant. So I aged half of the blend on straight huckleberries, and then half the blend on an equal amount, about 4 pounds per gallon huckleberries and Amberana barrel spiral. Now, when I gave this to you, is that right that I recall that you said, what's Amburana?
Yeah, I'd never heard of it until you gave this to me, and I did some Googling myself, but I'd like to hear your explanation.
Yeah, so like everything in this world, I was inspired by a brewing article that I read, and there was an article in BYO magazine a few years ago about, I think, Gordon Strong's travels in Brazil at a Brazilian beer competition or something, and he was talking about all these unique Brazilian ingredients that the intrepid homebrewers and pro brewers were using out there. And one of the things he talked about was Amburana wood, and Amburana wood is Amburana is a tree that's native to Brazil, and they'll make barrels out of it and age cachaça in it, which is that like a rum? Is that right?
I think so. Yeah.
And it's like technically different in terms of production and ingredients, but it's like a Brazilian rum style drink. It's really nice. Give it a shot sometime. And but there's Amburana variants of that. They'll age, instead of like stainless or neutral wood or something, they'll age the cachaça and Amburana. So what I did is I found some Amburana aged cachaça, and I got this Amburana spiral from the major spiral producer, and boiled it to get rid of any contaminants and extra tannins that you don't want. Drained that water off, and then aged the Amburana wood in Amburana aged cachaça. And then I took that and I added that to the Huckleberry blend, half of it, for the Huckleberry Amburana variant. So what people are saying that Amburana provides this wood is like cinnamon and baking spice and like almond and vanilla maybe. And it's a very interesting wood. And my homebrew club split a large pack of spirals because it was only available at the time, was only available for like commercial accounts. So we had to throw down as a club to like give a manageable amount to everyone, and I still have some left years later. It's that potent. And we had a lot of people that made overly Amburana beers because it's like, seriously, in a 5-gallon batch, maybe a third or a quarter of the spiral is all you need because it's that potent. And I think that this beer did a really good job of striking the balance of providing some of the Amburana character, again, cinnamon spice, but without overpowering it. But now, a year later, I'm not getting that much anymore. And you, as an Amburana virgin, I'm kind of curious if you could still taste any sort of nuance that might be providing at this point.
So unlike the limeade beer where I couldn't pick up any of the lime and I thought I would, like you said, I'd never had Amburana. I love huckleberries. We'll eat them right off the vine or the bushes. They just grow wild in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up eating those as snacks, just running through the woods. So I know that flavor very well. Amburana, like you said, I'd never heard of it. And I had the intentions of looking up what exactly Amburana was. I didn't even know it was a wood, dude. But one of the unique things about where we were camping at the time is that I was off the grid at different areas on this huge campground, right? And so at the time we were drinking this, I didn't have any cell phone access. I couldn't look it up. I only got to looking it up 2 days ago while I was prepping the notes for this episode. And I'm going to read to you exactly what I wrote on my little note card as I was drinking this beer for the very first time, sitting up in the beautiful weather in the Pacific Northwest. It tastes like the holidays in a very good way, like a berry crumble with hints of vanilla, cinnamon, and granola. Wow, this is amazing. So that the fact that I nailed, I mean, that makes me feel pretty good after not being able to detect lime in a limeade beer. The Amburana did whatever it was supposed to do in this. And like you said, I put, emphasis on the word hints of vanilla, cinnamon, and granola. My buddy Tagi, he took a sip and he looked at me and he was like, "What is this?" He enjoyed it. It did not taste like what your normal typical Coors Light drinker would expect from a beer. But here's the thing. It also didn't come across like these modern uber sweet dessert beers that you'll find at most breweries nowadays. This was dry, crisp, refreshing, but it had all of that unctuous flavor and this kind of full presentation of these various aspects that I personally don't necessarily associate with beer. Man, I feel like you nailed it. And it's funny hearing you say that the Amberana character kind of fell off and that it was stronger in the past. It was absolutely there. And in the amount of it was, in my opinion, just right. I mean, it blended with that berry flavor. The beer was good. The underlying beer was great. The fermentation was absolutely excellent. The carbonation, this of all of the beers, again, I'm not going to drink pint after pint. It's just a little too much for me. But of all of them, it was the most fun and to drink. And on that note, I would say that probably my favorite of all of them, followed closely behind by the just basic Belgian Saison. What a unique beer you constructed here, Jordan. I mean, so much fun to drink.
Well, that really warms my heart to hear because it sounds like you got exactly what I was going for. I think that me having so much experience with this beer a year later, it's definitely more nuanced and dropped off a little bit, but not in a bad way. And I think it's still a very drinkable experience. You know, I said it's like Berliner strength, so you can't. It's sour, but not too sour, and you can drink a pint of it. And I think that Amberana just adds this really fun background element that I think blends really well with the huckleberry, kind of like a huckleberry pie was kind of the vibe I was going for. And you're like unassisted, unaided, truly raw notes. The fact that it lined up with that's really fun to hear.
Well, here's what I'll say. I've gone on the record, as it were, and said that I'm not a huge fan of spiced beer, whether that's, pumpkin ale or, I think now people are calling it autumn ale or whatever.
Same.
There's something that, you know what I'm saying? There's something about there's like a numbing thing that happens in my mouth when people use cinnamon and nutmeg and clove in beers. It's just not my jam. This was, though, and what I would be really interested in, and perhaps somebody out there will do this and maybe send me a bottle, is a basic blonde ale hit with just like you said, a smaller amount of Amberana and aged on that for a relatively small amount of time, 3 to 4 weeks maybe, and to see if that comes through in the same way, because this tasted like a huckleberry crumble. I mean, it was so good to me. And it had, you're right, the acidity from the sour beer was there. But to me, again, it aided in that fruity impression. It really contributed to that. This was, of all of them, in my opinion, the one where I was like, holy cow, he really balanced this. All of the EQ, knobs were exactly where they needed to be to make this beer into this gestalt that it was, right? This berry crumble flavored beer that happened to have no actual spice in it. This is my jam. I mean, if you're going to make a dessert beer, maybe pick up some Amberana and try doing it with that. You might figure out that you're getting more of what you want, because there's that kind of warm caramely vanilla thing that you get from even oak. You can get it from oak. You take the other components that you get from Amberana, and it was just absolutely, hit it out of the park. I loved this beer. So excellent job on that one. How many bottles of this one do you have left, Jordan?
Not that many, probably a dozen or less, maybe 6 even.
My suggestion would be open up those bottles around the holidays, enjoy them. It was so perfect in my mind, closing my eyes and just putting myself in front of a fireplace, watching National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. That's where I went. So absolutely delicious beer. All of them were so good, Jordan. Thank you so much for sharing them with me and allowing me to share them with my buddy Toggy, who again, sometimes it can be a little scary sharing beers like that with the uninitiated. And I know, he said he had a lot of fun trying them, even if he didn't love every single one of them. That is all the time we've got for this episode. Do you have any final words on your experiences brewing farmhouse ales?
I'm just so glad I got to share these beers with you. We talk so much, but we live so far away. We don't ever get to share each other's beers. And it was really cool to actually show you what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and again, you invited me to your place. My wife took the kids down to Powell's bookstore and had some fun for a couple of hours while you and I just sat in a basement and drank beer like the good old days. So I appreciate that. And again, excellent job on all of these beers. Now, if you want more details on any of the beers discussed, Jordan, I have a feeling you'd be okay if people reached out to you at jordan@brewlosophy.com to ask for details.
Yeah, feel free to send me any emails if you have questions about Farmhouse Brewing, and there are plenty articles on the website to peruse as well.
Absolutely. Again, that's jordan@brewlosophy.com. You don't have to put my name first on all emails. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, where host Martin Keene covers a bunch of fascinating topics in the worlds of brewing and beer. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.